We are visiting today, September 11th, 2009, with Larry Cousins. Larry, it's good to see you. We appreciate you being with us. Before we get underway, I'd like to just express a word of appreciation to Jim Lee and Paul Barnes for arranging this interview and for putting it on tape. Well, Larry, we appreciate your willingness to join us here today. As you probably know, our Church History and Archives Committee has adopted a project that will, we think, add significantly to the recorded history of our church. And that is by taping a conversation with our deacon chairman at the conclusion of their term of office. Now, incidentally, you're the very first deacon chairman to be interviewed, so you're special. And you're also setting the example for others to follow, because it is our plan to continue this practice with succeeding deacon chairman year after year at the end of their term of office as well. Well, we know that you served as chairman of deacons for 2 consecutive years, Larry.
Right.
I think it was 2006 and 2007.
Correct.
And that's rather special in our view. Jim Lee is a history buff, and he likes, as he calls it, trivia. So he did a little research on this point. And he says that over the past 85 years, I guess that's as far back as he was able to take it, but during that period of time, there were only 10 men in our church who served as chairman of deacons, who served 2 consecutive years. So it's in a kind of a special category all of its own. And certainly serving in that position for 2 years is a challenge, I know, and it's also an honor, but I suspect you would say that, well, it was just a rewarding experience. Can't argue with that, can we? Well, first, Larry, let's review just a bit of your biographical information.
Okay.
Your family, where you were born, when and where you were born, I should say, and who your parents were, where you grew up, your children, whatever you care to share with us.
Okay. Well, I was born in Decatur, Georgia, on October 15th in 1942. My parents were J.B. and Alline Cousins, and we moved here to LaGrange in about 1943, 44. And I actually went to First Baptist Church up until the time I was in the 1st grade. And at that time, my father went into the dairy business with his brother over in Meriwether County, which is the adjacent county. And I went from 1st grade to, I graduated from high school in Meriwether County. But LaGrange was always kind of the cultural centers where we did our shopping, and so we have always had close ties with LaGrange when I was coming along.
Good, good. Let me ask you, Larry, when and where did you accept Christ as your Savior, and where did you join the church?
Okay. We went to church in the St. Mark's community over in Meriwether County, and the church was a little Baptist church, Union Baptist Church. And during revival, when I was in just before I started the 5th grade, when I was 12 years old, I accepted Jesus as my Savior and joined the church during the revival in August of that year. And we were baptized in a fish pond that year.
It's interesting, yeah.
So it was when I was 12 years old.
12 years old. Well, when did you join First Baptist on the Square?
Okay. Well, I was after college, I went to service and was an Army officer for 28 years. And then we went to West Virginia and lived there for 10 years. I had a job with the West Virginia Turnpike, and then upon retirement from that job, we came back to LaGrange in November of 2002. And the joined First Baptist Church in January, first Sunday in January 2003.
Very interesting, Larry. Now, I think maybe in something you said, you've already expressed your attitude, but I'm going to ask you anyway if you would share with us what really attracted you to our church.
Okay. Well, we had family ties, of course, over the years.
I see. Yeah, right.
And my sister had been married in this church, and of course we'd gone here when I was in Sunday school. And so when we returned, it was kind of a normal thing. We had good friends that were members of First Baptist. So it was a normal thing for us to come to church here. And as soon as we started attending, it was apparent that First Baptist Church was everything that we desired and wanted in a church. And it was kind of a no-brainer. You don't go look somewhere else when you find something that you're completely and totally satisfied with. So that's why we joined the church.
Well said. Good. Thank you. Well, let me ask you now about your wife, Ray.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about her and where she grew up and who her parents were.
Okay. It was Raymond and Helen Mitchell were her parents. She was actually born in Thomaston, Georgia, and her mother and an older sister was killed when Ray was 3 years old. So her father and another sister and Ray moved in with a sister, her father's sister and brother-in-law in Griffin. So she spent most of her young childhood in Griffin, Georgia, and then her father moved to Athens when she was in high school. So she was, between Thomaston, Griffin, and Athens was where her formative years were.
Yes, yeah. How did you two meet?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I was in the Army. Mm-hmm. I went to North Georgia College and graduated in 1964 and was commissioned as a lieutenant in infantry and decided to make that a career. And I served 2 tours in Vietnam, and during my second tour in Vietnam, my sisters, who had gone to North Georgia also, knew Ray. Matter of fact, one of them had roomed with her in college, and they encouraged her to start writing me letters in 67 and 68. And so we exchanged correspondence that year, and then when I came home in November 68, we met for the first time. And we're married in July of 1969, about 7 months later.
7 months later, good for you. Okay, well, Larry, you mentioned that you, of course, had a career in the Army, and you were an officer.
Right.
What was your rank at the time you retired?
Okay. I retired when I was 50 years old, after 28 years, and I attained the rank of colonel. And spent I had 2 boys, and it was a good place for them to grow up, yes. Traveling around. And I had assignments in Vietnam, West Point, and a lot of airborne units were the troop units that I was in. And like I say, we retired when I was 50, and then went to West Virginia and was a general manager of the West Virginia Turnpike there for 10 years. Okay. And then we moved down to LaGrange.
I see, yeah. As we think about it, you may well have been the only career military officer who served our church as a chairman of Deacons. We don't know that for sure.
I think I was the first one in my family to serve in
so
military.
You are very special in that sense. Okay, let me mention your son. I've heard that he is kind of following in your footsteps. Is that correct?
Right. The 2 boys. The first one was in artillery as an officer for 5 years, and determined that was not the career that he wanted to pursue. And the younger boy, Lawrence, is now been in 14 years, and he's stationed at Fort Drum, New York, and he's a major in the explosive ordnance disposal. He's an EOD officer. So we're real proud of both of them.
I'm sure you are. I understand a bit about the responsibility of the position of chairman of Deacons. especially about the relationship that he plays with key people in the church. Let's talk about that just a little bit, if we may. Let me ask you this: had you served in this similar position before as another church?
Well, when we were in West Virginia, we lived in a town called Hurricane, and attended Hurricane First Baptist Church, and I served on the deacon board there. And the last year I was there, I was the chairman of the board of deacons there.
What would you say, Larry, would be the really significant traits, character traits, that were necessary to really be effective as a chairman of deacons?
Well, first of all, just being a deacon is the traits that require that. It's really an honor and a privilege, and it's really, people should look at that, I believe, as a service. To be the chairman, I really think one of the most important things is you're equal to all the other deacons, but you really need to walk the walk, talk the talk, so that you have credibility with everyone. And that's important, and I think you need to work to be spiritually mature also in the things that you do and the way that you approach things.
Yes, good, thank you. Well, in your view, Larry, what's the difference between this sort of a, quote, manager's job and a similar job in the secular world?
Well, like my experience is a little bit of both in the military and in the secular world with the West Virginia Turnpike. And,
right.
In a way that was it's a lot easier because you in the positions you're in, you have certain authority. Mm-hmm. You can make plans the way you think they ought to be, and then you can execute those plans and get to the bottom line, and just a lot of it's just drive it to make it happen. When you're working within the church structure, it's very, very different, I think. It's you have to work with the people, with those that you're serving with, and you have to really keep in mind always it is not your church, it's not what the things that you want to do. It's the Lord's house, and it's the Lord's programs, and you have to work with people to reach what you feel is a common goal. And so it's a lot of it has to do with information, sharing information, because people want to do good for the Lord and good for the community, and it's just a question of working together so that you arrive at the conclusion and make a decision of where you want to go with it.
Yes, and picking up on that point about working together, thinking in terms of your relationship with the pastor, how do you view the role of a deacon chairman in his relationship with the pastor?
Right. Well, what you have to, I think, and you believe that you need to be supportive, support him spiritually and in prayer, and be loyal to him, because he is the pastor and he's the shepherd of the flock. But you also have, I believe, have a responsibility of being very honest and candid with him, and establish a relationship with him, with the pastor, so that you can speak openly and with full candor to give him the benefit of your advice and
well said.
The information that you may have received from different sources than he does.
Yes, good. And now what about the relationship with the congregation as a whole?
Well, that's sort of the other side of the dynamics. You have the staff, the pastor, and then there's the congregation. And I think one of the greatest services that deacons and the chairman of the deacons can do is to be transparent with them, to always be open, to always be approachable, and go beyond that, actually seek advice and to get the true feelings of everyone on what they think the best move the church should be making in certain areas whenever there's a decision to be made. So that's important to do that, and then the chairman's in a unique position to sort of bring those together.
Yes.
So that there can be a decision made that everyone will feel comfortable with, and everyone will feel like their ideas have been, represented.
Sure.
And the one thing I didn't mention before is I think it's important, especially for a chairman, to always, when I was talking about not his church or whatever, or your church, is don't bring any agendas to the table. You should never think, or a chairman, I don't feel, I sound like I'm preaching right now, but to you, but Jack, I just think it's important to always keep that in mind.
Yes,
that is
well said.
What the congregation, really what the Lord wants us to do.
Yes. In those two, what could be thought of as opposite relationships, pastor, congregation, do you really see any conflict?
No, sometimes I don't know that there's, I guess it could be. I've fortunately never experienced that. But I think it's really just coming from two different sources.
Sure.
The pastor is always privileged to more information, a different information, and is usually kind of out front of the majority. I'm not saying all the congregation, but the majority of the congregation on feedback and information. So it's really a question of building that together and informing the congregation and keeping them informed and help to build them and a consensus on where the program should go from there.
Good. Very well said. Well, Larry, let's turn to the accomplishments that were made in our church during the 2 years that you served as deacon chairman. I know one of the most significant things, I'm sure in your mind as well as minds of many of us, was the development of the Quarian Ministry. Would you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, it was that was a really a fun thing, and I think a very wonderful thing and a significant step in the church's history, because in late 2006 and 2007, we had an opportunity presented to us by the North American Mission Board and the Georgia Baptist to create a Quarian Ministry here in LaGrange, Georgia. And the thing that triggered that, I believe, was the building of the Kia plant, just south of LaGrange, close to West Point.
Yes.
And the North American Mission Board and Georgia Baptist wanted to start a church here. So we agreed to work with them, and in conjunction with them, we interviewed and hired James Yu as the first pastor of that church. And First Baptist Church is sharing financial responsibility, physical plant with them, and then spiritual support. And the church has grown from, I think, the first meeting they had about 20. Here we are almost 2 years later, and it's maybe it is 2 years later. They're up to about 200 plus or minus on any given Sunday.
Excellent growth.
We also, besides our chapel that they use, the church provides them the New Life building, and that has really become more than just a part of the church. It's really kind of become a cultural center for the Quarian community. They have cooking classes, English classes, youth programs, prayer meetings, and it's really given them a place to come together and share and feel at home here in LaGrange. Their youth are actually participating in a lot of our programs, and it's been wonderful to watch that develop.
Well, I appreciate so much the role you played in that, and we owe you a debt of gratitude for it. It is rewarding to look at what's happened and how it's affected them, and also our own congregation.
Well, I had very little to do other than interviewing and just supporting. There's an awful lot of people like Margaret Ross and many, many others in our church that have put in hours and hours of volunteer work, and it's really been great to see two different cultures and people share a common thing in Jesus, in our Lord.
That's great. That's great. Well, let me ask you as we kind of wrap up here, if there are other significant events that occurred during your time as chairman, or other accomplishments that you'd like to comment on?
Well, there's just one that people might be interested in, and that was a change in the staff structure in 2006. The personnel committee and the deacons, and we decided to start a church administrator. Has created that position because Dr. Baxter and the ministerial staff is so busy in shepherding the flock and hospital visits, home visits, and just preaching, teaching, and running the church.
Right.
That it's many times it's hard to get the administrative things all wired together and brought about. And so Anthony Criswell, who was our associate minister of music, was asked to step up. He continued those duties, but he's now the church administrator.
Yes.
And has been doing a wonderful job of just tying together all the different elements that have to go into running the church and administering the church. And I think it's really helped Dr. Baxter in many, many ways as our pastor.
It was a good move, certainly, and I think everyone would agree. Well, Larry, thank you so much for joining us and chatting with us here in this brief time together. You should know that this interview will be shared not only with the few of us on the Archives and History Committee, but with our entire church at some point, and not just this present generation of folks, but the future generation as well. And we thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Okay.